Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Emanuel Xavier about his poetry work and writing. Welcome, Emanuel.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited. So let me give a little history. So Emanuel has won the International Latino Book Award, the Gay City Impact Award. He has been inducted into the Saints and Sinners LGBTQ+ Literary Hall of Fame and was shortlisted for the 2024 Lambda Literary Awards. That's some good accomplishments. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So do you remember when you first started writing poetry? How old were you?
I was in my late 20s. I was in my mid-20s when I started, and I came onto the scene back in like 1996. I started off at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe in the Lower East Side, and at the time, spoken word poetry was really a thing, but it was very homophobic in the sense that it evolved from the whole rap community and the whole hip hop community. So there were very few of us that were out there, speaking our truths on stage. When I saw Cheryl Boyce Taylor and Reggie Cabico, telling their stories through poetry, I was so inspired, and I was like, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. That's what I want to do. And
I love that. I love that. So I know that from reading bios on you and reading your poetry and your work that you had sort of, well, I always hate to label something that wasn't my experience, but it seems like you had a tumultuous home life growing up, and there was a period of time where you were unhoused.
Yes.
And so did you weren't writing then? Because somehow or another, I pictured you carrying around a little notebook with you everywhere you went. I don't know.
No. At the time that I was out on the streets and a club kid, I was consumed with like anger and so I wasn't writing at the time. It wasn't till I was working at a Different Light bookstore, which was one of the major bookstores in New York City at the time. That I started picking up the books that were up on the shelves. And one of the things that I noticed was that there weren't many books that were reflecting my own personal experiences. There were definitely like openly queer Latino writers like Jaime Manrique and Michael Nava, but I wanted to tell our stories as like New Eurekans, or like my own personal experiences, having been homeless and hanging out at the West Side Highway Piers and being part of the whole ballroom house community. And that's when I started writing.
I love that. Well, so I love a Different Light bookstore experience.
Yeah.
So how long did you work there?
Oh, I was there for many years. I don't know, like at least 5, perhaps
Oh,
even more than that.
oh,
But
that's wonderful. I do think, and I do applaud you, because I think sometimes it can be overwhelming to look around and not see yourself represented. And it's very easy to give up and say, well, I don't see myself, so bother it all. But to be able to take it and say, I don't see myself, and say, hey, look, I need to get my voice out there so other people can hear it. That's very brave in my estimation.
Thank you. I remember there were like really major novels that came out around that time, like by Scott Heim and Dale Pack, and they were very inspiring. But for me, it was like I wanted to share my own personal experiences before somebody else decided that they were going to tell my story. I wanted it to be authentic, even if it wasn't the best written. At least it was my own authentic self.
Well, that's right, because it's so easy for other people to want to misappropriate our experience by saying, oh, look, this is what happened. And if it's not what happened to me, I don't need you to be taking over my life. So I think it's important, when we find our voice. So
Yes.
you offered something before we started recording that I'm going to take you up on. Will you read a poem?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Let me just pull it up.
And is it from your latest lovely child? Or is it from,
Yes, it's
okay.
from Lovely Child, just right here. And this one is called Après le feu, which means after the fire. Um, if I said that correctly. I am safe in our home with my husband, living the life, all new appliances. There's that clip from Paris is Burning when Venus extravaganza equates prostitution to what women in the suburbs do to get a washer and dryer. I was not trans like her or Angie, but we did what we had to do to make our coins. I get to still be here today, too old to hustle, shoplift, or risk getting killed. The only mopping I do these days is occasionally on the kitchen floor. In those days, everyone was afraid of dying of AIDS or simply dying. We belonged to houses because most of us were homeless. Our fathers abandoned us because they already had families, and our mothers cast us out as demons or something similar. We all had stories, many forgotten. Our parents were never wrong. It was our fault if we came home bloodied from school or found dead in a cheap hotel room. No one felt bad for us, the family, the cops, the government. We deserved it. That's all. But now, children can choose their gender, be celebrated for coming out, live in fluidity. I survived at the expense of my sisters being sacrificed. I remember the chicken hawks we fought off, the closet cases on the DL, dark alleys, married men with wives at home cooking dinner, being a dirty little secret. And now I only worry about paying Con Edison, ordering DoorDash, Amazon delivery. We were criminals, prostitutes, destined for prison or hell. Now I Google my dead friends to see what is said about them, make reservations to go out for ouchy dinners, plan our next vacations. I pay tribute with poems I read to high school students, inmates, nostalgic New Yorkers. New generations get crowned and walk away with Anastasia Beverly Hills cosmetics for being the best at what our girls were once eliminated for. If they were alive today, would they still be celebrated or murdered in a world that's still violent towards queer and trans people? There are essays and articles about how we lived. I tell my spouse stories as we dine somewhere safe and welcoming. I sleep like the child I never really got to be, dream for all our angels who never had this moment.
So wonderful, so evocative, and so sharing. Thank you for sharing your truth, because these are things that we watch. For those of us who've watched Pose, it's great entertainment. But I think that when you see something like that on television, it's both enlightening, educational, but it's also very far removed.
Yes.
There's a television screen and somebody is acting out a story and I'm removed from it. But when you meet someone who has lived that experience and then they share that experience, it is so very powerful.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I was a big fan of Pose, but at the same time, they didn't capture the whole essence of our community. I mean, there are other stories to be told.
Absolutely. So, are any of your fellow housemates still around?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them, but definitely lost a lot of them along the way. One of my biggest champions when I started writing was Willie Ninja, who I adored. He was, he wasn't like my mother or father, but um, he was definitely a role model for me, someone to look up to, and he was very proud of me
Oh,
when I
I'm
started
glad,
writing.
and I'm glad some have survived, because as you describe in your poem, it is a very dangerous world we live in, but it's very, very dangerous when you're marginalized, when
Yes.
you're looked on as less than. Um,
Hmm.
Something completely out of left field, but we had a a fellow who walked the neighborhood quite a bit, an alcoholic fellow who was never without a beer in his hand, and he passed away 2 days ago on the sidewalk, and it's just one of those things that he was always friendly and nice, but here is someone, and I keep thinking, I wonder if his family will ever know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah, absolutely.
when you're marginalized, you're just in a different world than someone who can pick up the phone and order DoorDash. It's a very different world.
Yeah, and people forget that. I mean, obviously, there's still, a lot of our children are still, being rejected and kicked out, in spite of all the progress. But there was a time when you were just kicked out and you got older and just forgotten, and you had no family to bury our dead.
Yeah. So, do you speak in schools now?
Whenever I have an opportunity to, absolutely. I used to have a lot of opportunities to read at colleges and universities across the country. Um, I was with Out Media. Shelley Weiss was the head of Out Media. Unfortunately, she passed a year ago, and Out Media is no longer, you know, um, booking people. So I'm kind of on my own as far as you know getting college gigs, and also the pandemic I think really affected
Yes, of
the
course.
finances that LGBTQ organizations within these campus organizations have.
Yeah. So I'm on another podcast called Queer Magnolias, and a couple of weeks ago we did an episode about Gay Pride Month as far as sales goes, and everybody getting on board to make money. But this year was very different than last year. So 2023 seemed to have a lot of LGBTQ representation as far as Pride Month goes. Every department store wanted their LGBTQ plus flag flown out front. This year it seemed to be a lot different. So I'm also wondering, how has that impacted, say, speaking engagements? Do you find that companies and universities are a little less willing, or have you found much of a difference, or has it only been, say, the pandemic, you think?
I think the pandemic definitely affected it, but I think it's definitely slowed down because of banned books and people's fear of the controversy that bringing LGBTQ plus artists would create. I mean, obviously, it depends on what city or what state you're visiting, but it's definitely been a lot more challenging. People are a lot more skeptical to bring us in to
Which
share
is so
stories.
which is so sad, because everyone has a unique and individual voice. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, we hear from those that yell and scream the loudest. And
Hmm.
that's not who we should be listening to. We should be listening to fellow travelers who are trying to, head in the right direction, whatever that direction is, but in a more positive direction.
Yes, yes, definitely. I think it's important that people hear our stories because they could find beyond the differences our similarities.
Precisely. Precisely. It's a human experience. I
Yes.
mean, it really is. So that brings up something that the first time that I met you was at Saints and Sinners in 2023. And on Saturday, you read one of your works. And on Sunday, you were you were inducted into the Saints and Sinners LGBT Literary Hall of Fame, and Brenda Curran read the exact same poem that you read on Saturday. The two of you had such different voicing, but your work just shined such a light, and it was so absolutely wonderful. Do you find that Do you like to hear your poetry read by other people? I know that's going to be a difficult question. You can refuse to answer it if you want, but
Oh,
is it
no.
gratifying, or is it a little scary, or how does that work?
I thought it was amazing. Brenda did
Oh,
such a terrific job. What I loved most about it was that, art is subjective. So she took my poem Stepfather and brought in her own voice and her own emotions and her own approach to it. And I loved that, you know. And I had staged one reading event where others read my poems instead of me. And it was just amazing to hear other people's take on your poetry, to find the musicality within it, and what words they emphasize, or what struck them most, because you know it's one thing for me to read a poem in front of an audience, but at the end of the day, the readers are just reading the poem on their own, and they're hearing it differently in their own head. They have their own take.
So I had the poet Thomas Nealon on an episode of Out with Dan, and I said to Thomas that sometimes poetry intimidates me, and it's because I can't quite find the voice. And so, and he said, Dan, just go through it. Don't worry about what you can't hear. Worry about what you're reading, and did you enjoy it? And I really appreciated that, because it freed me up to be able to do just that, to read it and not try to be so perfect to make sure I've got the voice right, because it's not my voice. I just simply need to read what's on the page, so I'll hopefully understand where the author of the poem was going.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
So one thing I want to mention, there was one of your poems that had the following in it: you have the right to remain silent, and silence equals death. And I never really thought about how very related those two things are. I think that in the world we live in right now, there are people who would like to silence our voices, and it's so important that that not happen. No matter what your voice is, maybe you write crime fiction or maybe you write rom-com, but everyone's voice needs to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you.
No.
And in that poem, that's from Latinx is, and that was, where, my own experiences is not only being queer, but also being Latino. So, you're like a double minority, and you have, so much, we all have things that we have to protect ourselves from.
Yes.
But it's important not to remain silent. It's important to speak up.
Yes, because if we don't, no one will ever hear our voice. We can't, there is like that little Bible verse, don't hide your light under the bushel. Well, the thing is, if we do that, then someone else has won, because they've actually managed to silence us. And that does become our own death, because if we don't get our truth out there, it's not correct. I do want to show the cover of Lovely Child. Hopefully it'll come through. It is so absolutely gorgeous. Who did the artwork?
Timothy Cummings,
okay,
who I met at Saints and Sinners, is an amazing, amazing artist. I love his work. He's from Albuquerque, and I think we collaborated very closely on getting something that was similar, but it wasn't meant to be me specifically. But I think it captures the essence of the poems inside the book, in the eyes. And
so it's funny you mentioned that, because the eyes are so expressive and they invite you in. And when I look at the cover of that, I feel like the eyes see me just as I see them. So it was what a great choice. What a great choice. So do you have any live dates coming up?
I do actually, at Governor's Island in New York on July 13th. I'm going to be part of the New York Poetry Festival. I'm actually kicking it off at 11 a.m., which is very early. And then on July 20th, I'm going to be at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center's an event that is part of the Dodge Poetry Festival, which is huge. And I'm really looking forward to. We're celebrating, the New Eurekan Poets Cafe, which is currently closed. It's under renovation. So we're going to be speaking a little bit about the history and sharing some of our poetry. And, tickets are available on Ticketmaster, I believe, which is also pretty weird.
That is awesome. I think that is so wonderful. Emanuel, thank you so much for joining me. This has been such a great interview and such great time. Lonely Child is out and available. Do you have a website or social media you'd like to share?
Yes, www.emanuelxavier.com. That's one M in Emmanuel. And you could just find me I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Emanuel Xavier, what you reading?
I am actually reading the latest issue of Poetry. They are featuring Samia Bashir, did an amazing job curating poets of Fire and Ink, and it includes poets like Pamela Sneed, Stacey Ann Chin, Cheryl Boyce Taylor, Sharon Bridgeforth, Marvin T. Wright, a whole bunch of poets that I have long loved and admired, and it's about time that they get their due.
Totally agree. Thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you for having me, and
What a wonderful time. Thank you.
letting me.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at outwithdan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.